Hi everyone, so my partner Alex and I are going to be talking about American Realism from 1865 to 1900 and American Naturalism from 1900 to 1914.
Hi everyone, my name is Alex and I will be presenting on realism. Realism is dated to have begun in 1865 and ended in 1900. It came after the American Romantic period that focused on emotion, imagination, and individualism. It was a reaction to Romanticism, and at its center, realism was characterized by representing the middle class life at the time. The last half of the 19th century was dominated by romantic drama on and off the stage, and even the theater was impacted by the realistic movement as the plays that were being written started to depict realistic day-to-day life with ordinary characters and events that were plausible. It was developed further in the time of the Civil War, which shaped many of the writers of that time to take a more realistic approach. This literary movement lasted until the 18th century, which led to the literary movement of naturalism in 1900, which is also known as the Gilded Age. Realism originated as a 19th century artistic movement that rebelled against the Romantics. While the Romantics felt that art should show the ideal, realist artists instead focused on truth rather than beauty. The subjects and plots of realist works, however, are anything but ideal or romantic.
So, naturalism is a period in United States history between 1900 and 1914. So it was actually only a 14-year period. And although it stemmed from realism, it differed in kind of its overarching framework. So while realism heavily focused on literary techniques, so it focused more on like the tech of actually writing, naturalism embodies a more philosophical position. So literature from the naturalist period attempts to apply the scientific principles of objectivity and detachment in order to study human beings and how we actually work as people. And it comes from the idea that humans are part of nature and subject to natural law. So humans are kind of below and subject to whatever nature wants to do. So naturalistic writers believed that through objectivity and through objectively studying human beings, the laws behind how these forces dictate our lives might be better studied and understood. So therefore, these writers utilize a version of what we call, right here, the scientific method. And so while writing these novels, they would kind of work through studying human beings and how our lives are governed by our inherent instincts and passions, along with the ways in which the characters that they wrote, their lives were shaped and guided by both heredity and environmental sources. So while they often utilize the realist technique of using the technically accumulating details, naturalists had a specific goal when they chose to write about a piece of reality, and that goal was to greater understand it.
Some common characteristics of this literature: it targeted the middle class and everyday life of the people at the time. It was a literary movement that depicted the struggle and strains of ordinary people, which was a great change from Romanticism, which focused instead on over-exaggerating details, as well as depicting the lives of unordinary people, like Realism did. The main characteristics of the Realism movement are ordinary people doing ordinary things that everyday people would have been doing at that time. Other characteristics that would be found in this literary movement and writings would be the events that took place in the books would be plausible, the tone would be matter of fact, there'd be great detail and factual descriptions, and there'd be representative scenes in everyday life without idealization. Other characteristics of American realism include objective or factual narrations, free will, sometimes optimistic, everyday settings, ordinary events, common characters. There is frequent use of colloquial speech. Diction is naturally vernacular, not heightened or poetic. The tone may be comic or matter of fact. The last characteristic is characters are of the middle and lower class. This was important because these were the types of people that made up the majority of those in the United States at the time of realism.
So, a little about the characters that naturalists wrote about. So, these characters were often ill-educated, and they were also usually from a lower class, usually a lower socioeconomic class. So their lives are governed by heredity, passion, and instinctual forces. And although these characters may try to exercise their free will, they're often unable to do so. So they'll try to make their own choices, but this sense of will is often overtaken by some sort of forces that are outside of their control and are acting upon them. An example of this is social Darwinism. So naturalist writings are usually set in an urban environment, although not always, and they specifically focus on ideas of degeneration. So one scholar claims that these novels offer a clinical as panoramic slice of drama, and that this is essentially a chronicle of despair. So each individual is made up of strong conflicting emotions, such as lust or anger or despair. And some other examples would be greed or a desire for dominance. So they fight to survive in an amoral universe. that is indifferent to their existence. So these characters work to attempt to contain the brute within, and the conflict in this literature is usually we have man against nature, and then we also have man against himself. So the naturalist period suggests that the belief in having a free will is actually an illusion, and that people are just acted upon by the larger and outside forces of the universe.
Two major events and cultural influences of realism were Civil War and Industrial Revolution in the USA. The Civil War took place during the years of 1861 and 1865. The Northern victory freed slaves and started the process that gave African Americans the same rights and privileges that all Americans experience. This also is the reason that there were many realist artists who were writing about war at the time. One of the most famous is Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage. This novel stays so in touch with realism because it does not glorify the war, but instead it tells the truth and depicts gory in the horrors that the war brought. The second historical event and cultural influence that must be noted is the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution allowed the social mobility and growth in the United States. The Industrial Revolution grew the United States economically, socially, and politically, and all these sections changed and after the Civil War, which allowed American realism to succeed. With that being said, it must also be noted that there was a great increase of population in the United States that was growing rapidly. Literature was also growing, but most new writers were not romantics or transcendentalists, they were realists. The aftermath of the Civil War meant that Americans were less certain and optimistic about their future. Therefore, the idealism of the Romantics and philosophy of transcendentalists seemed out of date and irrelevant to many readers. Thus, most writers at the time chose realism as their platform for stories.
So the major historical events and cultural influences on naturalism. So a majorly important influence on naturalist literature was actually Charles Darwin. So he published on the origin of the species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races and the struggle for life in 1859. Now, although the naturalist period doesn't actually start until 1900, so this work predated it significantly, it was an extremely important cultural influence that helped lead up to the naturalist movement. And in this book, he presents the theory that organisms gradually evolved through natural selection. So the idea of natural selection is that organisms with, say, a genetic variation that is supported by their environment, so that helps them survive in their specific environment, will have more descendants eventually than an organism that doesn't have the variation but is living in the same environment. So this influenced the naturalists to focus on the scientific principles of where we as humans and where as the rest of nature and the world essentially comes from. So, a little bit later, in 1867, so again, before the actual naturalist period, Emile Zola, it's a pretty significant one, published Therese Requin, French, and in its preface, he announced he was writing a new type of novel, the scientific novel. And the scientific novel focused on an early version of the scientific method. Cool. So this also influenced how other naturalist writers later down the line, once the actual 1900 hit, and that naturalist period started, how they would work and write their novels and other writings. And then finally, we have Friedrich Nietzsche, a German philosopher and a German name. And he significantly influenced naturalism through his ambition to explain how morality naturally coexists with therapeutic ambition. So this essentially just meant that it was a way in which he could show readers how they could escape morality. So this went along with most kind of like societal conventions and our kind of basic understanding of what was right and what was wrong. So eventually naturalism ended in 1914, and this was due primarily to the onset of World War I. And with the onset of World War I, there was a subsequent shift in literary focus, which brought the period that we know as naturalism to an end.
Prominent or emerging issues and perspectives found in realism. Morality. Morality is emphasized, with slave narratives being published along with the Civil War happening in 1865. The corruption of society and dependence on material goods as the industry is growing also characterized the elements found in realism. Short stories were more prominent and important to the audiences. And, for the first time, real life was put on display. Real life is interesting and should be written about, is one of the beliefs of realism and realistic writers. There was also a recognition of class. There was a recognition of lower class struggles and middle class struggles. For the first time, lower class and higher class were divided more than ever with the arrival of the Industrial Revolution that gave rise for people to be represented in everyday literature.
So, with the prominent or emerging issues that came out of the naturalist period, the main emerging perspective was that there was kind of the shift in literary focus, and the shift was toward the scientific. So it was more calculating and more trying to understand the fundamentals of who we are and how life works. So this was particularly through exploring how an early version of, again, the scientific method, so putting these two together, could bring about a greater understanding of humanity. And that was really the goal of a lot of naturalist literature, was to understand humanity. And more so than that, it was about trying to understand our place in the general cosmos. So, naturalism tested the idea that humans have a free will. And it suggested that we actually don't have much free will, and that instead we're living at the mercy of an unforgiving universe. And this universe does not put much regard into our existence at all.
Some of the major literary figures and themes of the Realism period. First, with the themes. Redemption of the individual and social world was brought forth. There was also a focus on world class and social class shifts from elite to a focus more on the poor and ordinary people of the time. Also, social criticism brought on due to the Civil War. Freedom was also talked about due to the Civil War. More than ever, people wanted to talk about morals and to depict characters being moral and choosing what they thought was the American way, the right way. Because of the Civil War, many writers wanted to use their platform to enable their readers to know moral issues and social issues of the time. Some important people. Mark Twain. He is known for writing Huckleberry Finn and The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, which dealt heavily on social criticism and depicted the lives of people at the time who were dealing with the shift from slavery to freedom and that adjustment. Henry James was also one, and another notable figure was William Howells. Authors such as Robert Frost, Mark Twain, Charles Chesnutt, and Henry James focused their writing on real-life situations with true-to-life characteristics. A major theme of this literary period is oftentimes authors would write as if they were documenting true events and including realistic speech patterns, such as y'all. Gritty characters and even unhappy endings. Lastly, naturalism is a common next step in the literary movement after realism, which occurred because it goes from realism, which valued reality and real-life depictions, to that of naturalism that deals with scientific theories and getting a more detailed account of not just literature and science, but also of other writings.
So, the major themes of the Naturalist period. Okay, so we first have survival. And this was just kind of how it sounds. It was focused on the need to survive in an unforgiving universe and how that need to survive can draw humans to doing some kind of terrible things. The next one was determinism. And this kind of focused that as humans, we really don't have much free will. And instead, we're just kind of being thrown around by the general universe and by nature, and that there's a greater outside force that is inflicting itself upon us and upon our lives. So, and then the next theme was violence. So, if you read naturalist literature, violence comes up a lot. And this kind of goes back to the idea of determinism and survival. So it's the idea that humans will do some truly atrocious things in order to survive, and that includes violence. And also that some truly horrible things will be afflicted upon humanity and upon individual humans, just because of the bigger forces of nature. So finally, we have the theme of taboo. And again, that one's pretty self-explanatory. It's just that naturalist literature was pushing the bounds of literature that had come before it, and it was testing new waters in a way that not everyone was actually necessarily comfortable with. So, we'll erase some of that, and we'll get into the major literary figures. So the first one we have is actually Stephen Crane. Now, although this book was actually published in 1893, so again, 7 years before the naturalist period actually started, his book, which is called Maggie, A Girl of the Streets, is actually often considered the first American naturalistic novel, despite its predating the time period. So this book focuses on a young girl named Maggie. So that's kind of the figure, the naturalist figure that we're associating with Stephen Crane. And she's from Bowery, and she's driven into poor circumstances due to poverty and eventually commits suicide. So this kind of comes back to the idea of violence and the idea of kind of like taboo content. And also a need to survive, but not necessarily being able to, despite her best efforts. Next, coming into the actual naturalist period, we have a man named Frank Norris. Oops. And in 1901, he published his book called Octopus. And this book focuses on the struggles of California wheat farmers in the San Juan Valley. And they are fighting against a railroad monopoly for essentially their rights and their ability to survive. Norris uses dramatized issues of environmental determinism, which we talked about earlier, coupled with issues of social justice. And this idea of social justice kind of just comes back to the idea of survival and doing whatever you can as a human to just get through life and to continue living, despite a universe that doesn't necessarily support you in that endeavor. And then next we have Jack London. And his book, which is often associated with naturalism, is called Call of the Wild. And this was published in 1903. And it stems from London's actual life experiences. And it tells the story of the relationship between a man and a dog. And it focuses primarily on the dog and his journey from a domestic family, living with a domestic family as a pet, to pulling sleds during the 1890s Klondike Gold Rush. And finally, we have Theodore Dreiser's novel, Sister Carrie, which was published in 1900. So we have 1900, and we have Dreiser. And this focused on kind of showing how young women can go further in life by being promiscuous with wealthy men than by toiling away in a factory. So this, again, would kind of be taboo for 1900, but it definitely showed how people were kind of reevaluating ways of survival and reevaluating how they were going to talk about their means of survival, essentially. And these novels really demonstrate the naturalist ideal that there is very little free will in life. They contain the desire to understand human beings and nature and our social environments better. But they really all come down to that free will is not necessarily something that everyone experiences. Alright, guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something about naturalism and realism.
Have a good finals!